my first area in El Salvador was San Juan. It was right by Ahuachapan, and it is a very homey area. It's definitely out in the pueblo, so out in the middle of nowhere, kind of. The best way I can describe it is it looks like a jungle. There's just vegetation everywhere. There's trees. There's plants. We were kind of on top of a hill, and from where we were, we could see the border of where El Salvador connected with Guatemala, and that was really cool because at night, or even if it was like thundering out or raining, you could see the lightning hit in Guatemala, even though it wasn't hitting El Salvador yet. So that was really interesting. Some of the, so that first area I was in, like I said, I was there for about 7, almost 8 months, and the house that we lived in, it was like a little tin house. It was probably one of the fancier houses in the area that we proselyted in because the houses there were basically made out of tin and tarps. And that's if people were lucky enough to have that kind of supply to build their houses. Otherwise, a lot of houses, they would make them out of anything they could find on the street, whether it was cardboard, whether it was, like I said, tarp was a common thing. They would tape tarp along poles and make houses with that. But like I said, that first house that I lived in, it was made out of tin, and I remember it being scorching hot. It was so hot because we didn't have any AC or anything like that. We didn't have running water, and we had these little fans that we would blow, but we hardly had any windows. I remember in our study area, which was also the kitchen area, we had one little window, but that was it. And then the rest were doors, and we'd always open the doors to try to cool off the house. And it was kind of interesting because it was so tiny that the hallway was where we actually slept. We actually stuck our beds in the hallway, and then the shower in the bathroom area was an outhouse. So we did end up bucket showering a lot because the running water usually didn't work, because we did have a shower head, but the water never, there's a lot of times that the water was cut off or it just didn't work properly. So we definitely had a fair share of bucket waters, and it was only cold water. My entire mission in El Salvador, we only took showers with cold water. And it actually felt nice because it was so hot and so humid. We just, we enjoyed the cold water once we showered. And then even though it was cold, we had showered with cold water, walking out of the shower, it's like instantly you're sweating again because it was so hot and so humid. But that was just all part of the adventure. Like, we didn't care what we looked like. We cared, but we didn't take as much time doing our hair or our makeup, because it didn't really matter because all of it would just, you're just sweating constantly. So that was my first house. And I guess something interesting is we did have a lot of bugs, we had a lot of geckos. They actually became my friends. I loved going to sleep and hearing the geckos in the little tin, in the little roofing of our house. The geckos were definitely probably my favorite part of the animals as far as that goes. We had a lot of flying cockroaches and spiders. The spiders were huge. I thankfully was never bit by any, although I did have companions that were bit by some spiders, and that wasn't good. There's a lot of mosquitoes, and a lot of missionaries. They got seriously sick because of mosquitoes, because of dengue. I never did, thank goodness, but I don't think mosquitoes liked me very much. Let's see, here's a funny story. One time so a lot of the lessons that we have usually took place outside, just because people don't really have space in their homes to fit, the missionaries and their family. So we were teaching a lesson outside, And I remember sitting there and something was like tickling my leg. And I was like, oh, maybe, maybe it was just my skirt blowing in the wind. I didn't know what it was, but I just like let it go because we were teaching a lesson. And then I felt it again, and instantly in my head I was like, oh my gosh, there's probably like an animal in my skirt. Like, I was so scared. But I like brushed it off. I was like wiping off my skirt, trying to, get whatever was itching my leg off. And then it just like kept on crawling up. So I stood up and I was like, Edmond, I can't teach right now. And out flew a cockroach from under my skirt. So I had a cockroach up my skirt, and that was really scary. I was screaming, and my companion went up and smashed it. And our poor investigators, they were laughing their hearts out. But it was great. It was very entertaining. My second area I served in, I was there about 5 months, and that was a hard area because my companion and I, when I first got there, we had to open the area, so we didn't have any investigators, we didn't have, we didn't have any work to start with. We had to build the work up, and that was really hard. But we served in an area called Molino. It was nice working in Molino because we didn't live in that area, so it was a little bit safer for us. Because in Sun Quan, there was a lot of times that people would follow us home, and it just wasn't a safe area because it was out in the pueblo, out in the middle of nowhere, so there wasn't as much light, and it was just a little bit sketchy. But my second area, Molino, we lived in the city. And it was a 2-floor apartment, and it had nice flooring. Everything was nice. We had running water. It was still really cold, but everything was just a lot safer, and it ran more properly. That area, though, that the city is a little bit more difficult to work in. The city was just more stubborn. People there, obviously, they have more. They have nicer homes, they have nicer things, so they aren't as dependent on religion. Everyone in El Salvador is super religious. They all believe in God, and they have a saying where they say primero Dios. So if we would ask like an investigator, like, would you be baptized, they'd always say, oh, primero Dios. Or if we asked them if they were coming to church, they'd always say primero Dios, which means God first. And at first when I got to the mission, I was like, this is awesome. Like, everyone's like always putting God first. This is great. And it wasn't until I finally had my companion, she was like, Hermana, when they say primero Dios, that means no. Like, and it's kind of, to me, it seems kind of sacrilegious, but whenever they say primero Dios, it's almost like a joke. So they're basically telling you no. So whenever we would say, like, are you going to come to church today? They would say, primero Dios. Well, that means no. So that was kind of disappointing to learn. But mostly everyone there, I never ran into anyone who didn't believe in God. And so they're all very religious. There's a lot of Catholics and a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses. We ran into a lot of those. There were a few Protestant, but they're primarily Catholic and they're primarily Jehovah's Witness. And that was very interesting. There was one time, and this was actually my first area, my companion and I were teaching a husband of a lady who was a member. So the mother was a member, and the husband he wasn't a member. And we would go and teach her because she was kind of less active. And one time we got there, and the Jehovah's Witnesses were there, and I was like, Hermana, like, we need to teach these people. So we tried to reschedule, but they were like, nah, come in. So we were like, okay. We asked the Jehovah's Witnesses, we're like, hey, is it okay if we share a quick message with you guys? And they were like, yeah, that's fine. And it was a little bit difficult because they wouldn't let us pray. So we had the guy that we were teaching pray, and then we shared a quick message. But that was interesting, getting to teach a lesson with Jehovah's Witnesses present. And it was a quick message. We left right after, but I just thought it was really funny because, I don't know, we didn't realize that this family was seeing the Jehovah's Witness, and here we are teaching with the Jehovah's Witness. So yes, it was definitely difficult in this city, and I think it was just difficult because we were opening an area and people, it was just a little bit harder to get the work going in the city. But everyone is super loving. It doesn't matter who you are. People love Americans there. They love offering you food. They just love you. That's what I love about the culture in El Salvador. They just love you to death. It doesn't matter who you are, and they love their neighbors. There's a lot of gang involvement in El Salvador, and so it was hard to... I mean, I never felt threatened. When I was in El Salvador, I always felt safe. There's only one time that we did run into a situation, my companion and I, and it was in my first area, and in Sun Quan, and we were walking. We went to an appointment. They weren't home, and it was already getting dark out. So I was like, okay, hermana, let's go home. And we were walking home, and all of a sudden we didn't really feel it, but like we heard noises past us, and it almost sounded like rocks being thrown at us. And we were like, this is weird. So we stopped, and we were in this dirt pathway. There's no lights around us because in my first area, they didn't really have street lights. So once it got dark, like it was really hard to be out that late, and it just became dangerous. So we ended up, so we were walking down this dirt road, and sure enough, we heard these like whizzing noises going past us, and we're like, what is it? Like it almost sounded like big bugs flying past us. And I turned to my companion, and she was like, maybe I thought I heard Marilyn, which is who we were teaching. And I was like, I don't know, hermana, like it's really dark, we should probably go home. And she was like, well, let's just check. So we went back, and by that time, like it was completely pitch dark, and we were using a flashlight. And I was like, okay, we should probably leave because I don't think what you heard was our investigator. And so we're walking down this road, and sure enough, we were getting rocks thrown at us, and they weren't like tiny rocks. Like we're talking huge stones. Like people were deliberately throwing rocks at us, trying to hurt us. And we, to this day, we both don't know who it was. I mean, we specifically don't know who it was. We know it was part of the gangs because that family that we were teaching, one of the daughters was actually dating a member of the gang, so they were coming after us. And unfortunately, we ended up dropping them. We couldn't teach them anymore because of that. But it just was a testimony to me that night that God really does watch over his missionaries, because I mean, these people were trying to hit us. These people were trying to cause harm, and both my companion and I were able to walk out of it safe. We could hear the stones, coming past us, and it was in the dark, and the fact that none of them hit us was a miracle to me. So that was just a testimony builder to me that God does watch over his missionaries. He watches them. So when I first got there, we went to the temple. When I first got there, the mission, there was 2 missions in El Salvador, but then they broke it up, so now there's 3. And we were able to go to the San Salvador temple, and that was a really neat experience because it was all the missionaries, and all 3 missions were able to gather in the Stake Center right by the temple. And we had a meeting, and I believe it was Elder Nelson who came. And I remember at the end looking up and seeing all the Latino missionaries crying, and that was a really touching experience to me because it made me realize how much people in Central America don't have the opportunity like us in the States to meet an apostle of the Lord or be close to them physically. And it was just a testimony to me how much like these people, how strong their faith is, because I mean, they're not, as far as distance goes physically, I mean, they can't go to the conference center, they can't meet, they don't have those meetings where they can just meet these apostles face to face, whereas a lot of us from the States can. And so that was just really touching to see and to realize that, man, There are a lot of us, a lot of people in the world that don't have that opportunity, and yet their faith is so strong that they believe all the words that they're speaking. In El Salvador, they have what's called a moto taxi, and it's basically a 3-wheeled, I would almost call it's almost like a motorcycle, but it's not. It doesn't even look like a car. It's not a taxi like what we think of it as. So it has the 2 wheels in the back and then 1 in the front, and those were really fun. Those are how we got around on P days, and around in Santa Ana, and those are just they're really funny contraptions. Those are really fun to ride in. We would always ride in those, like I said, to go shopping or to go to the closest church to go ride our families on P days. We did take a lot of buses in Santa Ana in the city, because where I served when I was in Santa Ana, my area, Molino, was not even close to where we lived, so we had to take a bus to our area. And that was really interesting. They literally cram as many people as they can in the bus, and there's so many stops. And the place that my companion and I stayed at, the apartment that we lived in, was right next to a bus stop in El Salvador or in Santa Ana. And it was really funny because they'd always be screaming out, like, I can't remember the direct saying, but they'd always be like, banga, 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 awachapan. They'd always say, like, wherever they're headed to, they'd always be, like, telling people to come. And people are, like, hanging out of the buses, like, out of the doorways, trying to grab other people if they're wanting to come in. And so that was always fun. I always felt like, we'd always joke with the other missionaries that we were always breaking the law of chastity because we're so close to everyone. It's just so tight and compacted. And it doesn't help when it's hot and you're sweaty and you're just crammed into this little bus. But that was also an adventure. And there were only a few members that had cars. I'm trying to remember. My first area, I think there was only 2 members in our ward that had cars. And so, yeah, public transportation was definitely a big thing. It was easy to contact people because of the buses, and also because everyone's always out on the streets. And they're very social, very interactive, super loving. I think that's why they're very loving people, is because they're always interacting with each other and super close. Sometimes a little bit more close than you like. Another thing about El Salvador is, like, they don't really have doorknobs or doors, I guess, in general. In the city, they did have doors, but you can't just walk in. And so, especially in my first area, we would always walk up to the gates, and a lot of people had fences, or even if they didn't have fences, we would, like, clap our hands. I would usually use a pen, like the pen I would use for my planner, and knock on the gate, and we'd always say buenas. That's just how we got people's attention. It would always be buenas, and people would just walk out. Sometimes if they didn't want to talk to us, they would just send their little kids out to us and say, hey, my mom's not home or whatnot. But I mean, that's how we would get a hold of people if they were in their houses. We would just knock using our pens or clap our hands or just yell buenas. So that was always fun. So in El Salvador, they do have wards. They were actually pretty big. I was surprised at how many members went in my second area in the city. There's quite a few members in the city. In my first area, they have a hard time retaining people. But we had quite a few families baptized, and we were working on getting people to go to church. It was just hard because the church was, like, at the top of a hill and everyone lived at the bottom, so it was hard for them to wake up and have to walk up because they didn't have transportation like they did in the city. And so that was interesting. But yeah, it just depends on the ward. You could have maybe 200 people in the ward, but only 60 people show up a week. So it just really depends on the area. So like I said, El Salvador is a very It's a jungle. There are some places you can go to. There's like pyramid ruins. I wasn't allowed to go any just because they were outside of my area. Only missionaries that were close enough could go. But there are pyramid ruins. My first area, like I said, we were on the border of Guatemala and El Salvador, and there was like a little volcano between the two, so that was kind of fun, getting to see that. El Salvador is just not a place to vacation. It's not, and I would say that just because of the crime rate and the humidity kind of makes it, a little bit stressful to be there. But it is beautiful as far as all the vegetation and the flowers and everything. But as far as places to visit, they have like big churches that you can go visit. They have a few parks, but there wasn't a whole lot that we could go visit. Most P days we spent washing our laundry because it took us about 2 hours to hand wash our laundry, and then just traveling to go get our groceries and coming back. So most of our P days were not spent traveling anywhere to see sights or anything, because most of it was spent just washing our clothes and shopping and getting ready for the week. So the weather there, it's super hot. Let's see, when I first got there, I got there in August of 2013. And by that time it was starting to get into the rainy season, and there when it rains, it rains. It rains cats and dogs. The thunder was really, really intense. We did have a few mini hurricanes, we could feel the ground shaking and everything. So when that happens, you just have to run under we had to run under either a table or somewhere secure. But the thunder, there were times, like my first area, the streets would get so flooded because of the rain, and I remember coming home and we'd be soaked. There's one time that there's 4 of us, because 2 of them were on exchanges, and it was at the end, and we were all running back to our house, and we literally were like swimming in the streets because the rain was so hard. And this bus had stopped by, and instead of charging us, he's like, "Hey, just hop in, like I'll take you wherever you need to go." And we're just drenched because we had been literally swimming in the streets. It just rained really hard there, and the thunder is unlike anything you can hear because it's so close and so loud. And it's interesting because like one of my first nights in the mission, I remember sleeping and the thunder scared me because I used to be scared of thunder. But also the animals. There's animals everywhere on the streets, cats and dogs. There's a lot of them. And I remember one night, I thought I heard a baby screaming right outside of our front door. And I was so scared because it literally sounded like someone was torturing a baby. And I asked my companion in the morning, I was like, "What was that?" And she was like, "That wasn't a baby, that was a cat. It was just a cat screaming, or a cat howling," whatever it does. And I was so scared. So that's really common. You just hear a lot of noises outside because everything's so close and there's animals everywhere. I remember my second area, we usually didn't have too many misfits with animals, but there were a few times that we got chased by dogs. At one point, we contacted this lady, and she told us to come back to her house. So we did the next day, and her dog was out in the front of the house, and her dog ended up chasing us, and it ended up biting my companion's skirt and ripping it. So that was fun. So the animals there are just wild and crazy, but it's all part of the adventure. A lot of common jobs for a lot of things that you see in El Salvador are the women on the streets making pupusas or papas fritas. Papas fritas are French fries, but they make them on the streets, and I love them because they make them with mayonnaise and ketchup and cheese. Oh, it's so good. So good. And that's a common job for the women. They either work in the marketplace selling like shoes or clothing, or you'll see them most commonly on the streets cooking food, selling food off the streets. For the men, a lot of them, especially in my mission, a lot of the guys would travel to the capital of El Salvador, so San Salvador, and they would work in some kind of administration building, or a lot of the guys in my first area, like out in the middle of nowhere, they would work in the coffee fields, or yeah, that was the most common. They'd be working in the fields. But most of them, a majority, would go to San Salvador and work in the capital.